This morning I'd like to talk about the passage from Exodus. And this story is coming right after Moses has convinced Pharaoh to let his people go, and they leave Egypt, and the Pharaoh chases after them, but they escape after the parting of the Red Sea, and there's all of this amazing stuff that happens, and then the Israelites end up in the desert. Now, a lot of times we like to focus on that big triumphant times, and there's the wonderful time when Moses he gets the Israelites out, and that's a wonderful, awesome thing. And then we just sort of fast forward to when they're all led into the promised land, right? But there's a lot of things that happen in between those two times, and this particular passage is one of those times. And the Israelites, you see, they didn't just go from point A to point B. It wasn't as simple as that. They didn't leave Egypt and then instantly go to the promised land. Instead, they actually had to walk to get there, which physically is very daunting. But on top of that, they were following the presence of the Lord, who cloud and a pillar of fire, who was guiding them to where they needed to go. Now, it would seem that in a community that has seen such amazing wonders, that has seen the presence of God, these people lived through the plagues in Egypt. They lived through the Passover, which is pretty crazy to think about, that they saw this miracle. They walked on the land when the Red Sea parted, and they escaped Egypt, where they were slaves. Now, those are all pretty big, miraculous things. And so, lo and behold, they get into the desert, and they start to question what they start to question their experience. And they start to wonder, is God still with us? Now, as the Israelite community is walking from place to place, they realize that they're in a desert. And anyone who knows anything about deserts know that there's one thing that is very particularly hard to find in a desert, and that would be water. Now, if you've ever watched any of those survival shows, like any of the extreme survival shows, they'll tell you that it is not easy to survive in the desert. There's a reason why civilization almost always was placed next to water, and it's because we need it to survive. And in the desert, there's just not accessible water, so civilization does not really exist all that often in desert communities. Now, the interesting thing here is how this story is presented. And the people start to fight with Moses. Now, if you read the book of Exodus, you'll realize that this happens a lot. The Israelite people really like to fight with Moses. And they like to do that because it's a very confusing time for them. They don't know what's going on. Poor Moses doesn't know what's going on, because all he was doing was following God, and it seemed like every time he followed God, things got even crazier. He said, God started talking to him in a burning bush. And it only got crazier from there. He's trying to lead them, and he's trying to guide them, but ultimately, he's just one person. And the Israelites are all trying to follow this person who not only did they see as someone who was raised in the household of the people who were abusing them, who were using them as slaves, but also he had murdered someone before he left. That's why he fled from Egypt and went away and was a shepherd for a while, because he had murdered someone and he needed to flee. So Moses isn't exactly the person that you would really have faith in, but as you see these wonderful, miraculous things, as you see God working in his life, they started to realize that they really needed to jump on board with this guy, and that God was really trying to lead them out of Egypt. So, lo and behold, they follow this guy out into this desert, and all of a sudden they realize they have no food and they have no water. And they're just following this guy that they who knows? Who knows what he's about? And things start to get very real very quickly. Now, I don't know if you know how long it takes without water for you to die from thirst, but it is not very long. It's only a couple of days. And so you can imagine that after walking and sweating and all of that, you lose water quicker. And these people were really, really in need of something to drink. And so they go to Moses and they say, you need to get us water to drink. You got us into this mess. Like, what are you going to do about this? You have to have a plan, right? There has to be some plan. You wouldn't just bring us out of Egypt to let us die here, right? And you can almost hear the doubt there. You can almost hear if you've ever had something really drastic happen in your life, and you just made a really big decision, and you get to the other side of the decision, and you're just sitting there thinking, oh no, did I make the right choice? And that's where these people were. They were like, oh no, did we make the right choice? Are we going to come out here and die? You know, and they start to question everything they saw and everything they experienced. And Moses, this poor guy, goes and talks to God, and he says, what are you going to do? Because they're about ready to kill me. And God responds, go in front of the people, take the staff that you struck the Nile with, strike the rock with it, and out of that rock, water will come for the people to drink. Now again, I don't know about you guys, but I've never really tried to hit a rock before, but I don't think it goes very well. I wouldn't expect water to come pouring out of a rock that I hit. It would be very confusing for me if it did. But sure enough, Moses listens and he goes, and we learn from this story that water does come pouring out and the people are saved. Now, throughout the Israelites' journey, this kind of thing happens again and again and again. They don't have food. When God gives them food, they don't like the food they've been given, so God gives them other food, and it just doesn't really go very well. But the thing that I'd like to highlight about this passage, the reason that I want to talk to you about it this morning, is because it was a really confusing time. It was a time where their leader, Moses, he really didn't know what he was doing. If you really read Exodus, you realize that this guy is just doing what God's telling him to do over and over and over again. He's not really sure what to do. And when he takes things into his own hands, they don't usually go very well. But it's also a very confusing time for the Israelite people, because they have put their faith, they've put their trust in this leader, and they've believed that he is going to follow God, but their eyes, the evidence around them in the world is saying, your God can't be here, because if he was, you would have something to eat, you would have something to drink. And they start to question the validity of God's presence among them. And we know from the end of the story, because we have a wonderful, wonderful thing called the Bible that has already written the story, that at the end of the day, God does provide for them. God gives them water to drink. But I want to talk about the time before that. Because I think a little bit of what we're going through right now seems to be centered around this confusion and this time where maybe it's a little bit easier to see the places where God isn't, or where we think God isn't. It's easier to look around at the world and say, look, with all of these viruses, these plagues, I've seen different people who are blaming all sorts of everybody. But in the middle of this, in the midst of this time, there are people who are crying out, why? Why did we go through everything we went through just to end up here? There's a bunch of people who are confused, who are looking to our leaders, looking to our pastors, looking to our bishops, looking to our governors, to our president, to find a time to lead us through this crisis. And we have leadership that they've never gone through this before. I know I certainly haven't. It's a confusing time. And we don't have the end of the story yet. It's not as easy for us to look and say, no, I can see God's presence among us here. I can see God's hand at work even now. But I can tell you that I have seen ways that God is providing in this community. We know our schools have been closed, and as a response from that, I've seen countless people who've risen up and are providing lunches for children who wouldn't be able to eat otherwise. There's people who are rising up and getting groceries for the people who are immunocompromised or who can't go out, who are offering to go get their prescriptions, all sorts of stuff like that. There's so much good happening, even in this time. You know, it's easy to see the chaos, it's easy to see all of that, but I really encourage you guys to remember that someday this too will be a memory. Someday we'll look back at this and we'll say, you know, those times were really tough. I didn't know what we were going to do, but God got us through. That's really what's happening in this passage, and it's so easy for us to end up just like the Israelites, not just now, but in all sorts of things that we deal with in life, to say, you know what, I know God provided before, I know I've seen this miraculous work that he's done, but we start to think, but was that really him? Was that really God at work? Or was there something else I didn't see? We start to doubt our own experience. We start to question God's presence in our lives. And it's really easy to do that once the memory becomes a little more distant, once things become a little more stagnant, and once we see the world around us. It can be really easy for us as Christians to just forget. For us as people to just forget. We do it all the time. But God was still among the people, the Israelites. He was still guiding them in the desert. He still provided for them food and water. And you know what? The Israelites, the ones that were complaining, they didn't get to see the promised land. Because later we learn they spent 40 years wandering the desert until that generation had passed. And then they were able to go to the promised land. But God was faithful regardless. Sometimes we get so caught up in our story, so caught up in our own personal walk with God that we forget that we're a community. That God's story doesn't start and end with us, but we're just a part of a much bigger tapestry. We're a part of something so beautiful. And when we start to forget who we are, when we start to forget that He provides, when we can't see the light at the end of the tunnel, or where maybe there isn't one, God's story doesn't end there. And how beautiful is it that we get to be a part of something so much bigger than ourselves. We get to be a part of a story that lasts throughout all times. We get to be a part of God's mission in the world. So I encourage you this week, this month, this year, throughout the rest of your life to look for the places where God provides. Maybe for some of you, it's writing down those experiences when they come to pass, when God's really touched your life, when you feel Him moving. Maybe you can write it down and read it later to remind yourself of what's happened. Maybe it means saying to God, I don't understand what's going on right now. I don't see you, but I want to. If you read the Psalms, there's many Psalms that are just like that. A lot of times when David or whoever wrote whichever Psalm you happen to be reading will write how things aren't going very well, but God is still God and He's still in control. And regardless, we will worship Him. That is where we are. We're walking through the desert, but God will be faithful. God will be faithful. Amen. Now we're going to move on to our final hymn, and this hymn is God is So Good. If you'd like to sing along, you may. You don't have to. Again, I apologize for the piano playing, but God is so good. God is so good. God is so good. He's so good to me. God cares for me. God cares for me. God cares for me. God's so good to me. God loves me so. God loves me so. God loves me so. God's so good to me. God is so good. God is so good. God is so good. He's so good to me. Well, thank you all for tuning in. I am so grateful for all of you who have decided to take some time and follow our online worship. I want you to wish you all a happy St. Patrick's Day. Got my St. Patrick's Day garb on. I know that that's not until Tuesday, but it's never too early to celebrate our favorite Irish holiday. I am so grateful again for all of you, for all of your support, and I encourage you all to stay safe and to stay home and to be that light in the world. I've been so blessed by each and every one of you. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to say a short prayer, and that will conclude our very first online worship service. If you'll bow your heads and pray with me. Dear Lord, thank you for everything. God, for orchestrating a wonderful way for us to worship together. God, be with us this week. Keep us safe from harm. Be with those who have put themselves in harm's way, and help to keep them as safe as possible. Be with everybody who's worried, who's weary, who's hungry for you, God. We thank you for your presence among us throughout this service, and help to keep us all from harm's way. In your glorious name we pray. Amen. Go in peace, everyone.